I get to chair interesting conversations from week to week on a show called Unbelievable. And I've had both Bishop Barron and Tom in conversation with other dialogue partners, but it's a real pleasure to bring them together today. And we're going to be discussing the question, how can the church tell its story in a post-Christian world? And there will be opportunity for questions later on. So you're going to use the Slido app for that, I'm told. There's the hashtag there to be able to submit your questions for a bit later on. But please, again, give a warm welcome to my guests, Tom Holland and Bishop Barron. Well, what a delight to be able to bring you both together. I know there's been a lot of anticipation for this dialogue at the conference today. Let's start with you, Bishop Barron. Tell us, firstly, the fact that you're so influential in your ministry, Word on Fire, on YouTube, in online spaces. Where's that come from? What kind of fruit are you seeing through that?
Yeah, it's a question people ask me a lot, and I've reflected on it. I'm not sure I have a really good answer. When I started doing my work in this more kind of public evangelization, and I do YouTube videos and various things, all kinds of people said to me, oh, no, don't do it like that. You can't be sitting in front of a bookshelf and with your Roman collar on and talking in a serious way. No one's going to listen. And this is a true story. We had a kind of a PR fellow early on, and he said, Father, I'd recommend you should lose the collar and the bookcase and maybe come in on a skateboard. I'm not joking. And I mean, thank God I didn't do that. And they proved nevertheless to be popular. And I think it would be some combination of truth and beauty. I've been a passionate critic of the dumbed down Catholicism that I got as a kid. So my generation, I'm not sure it's true here, but it was in the States for sure. After the council, not because of the council, but after the council, we dumbed down the operation, and it was a pastoral disaster. A lot of people have disaffiliated because religion seems stupid, or it doesn't answer the challenge of science or of the new atheists or whatever. So I tried to do it in a way that was smart, and then in my longer form, more like the Catholicism series, we really emphasized beauty. And my inspiration was your countryman. It was Kenneth Clark. I watched Civilization when I was a kid, and that changed my life. And I wanted to do something similar for Catholicism. So I would say some combination of truth and beauty is why it was popular.
Tom, your influence has also been felt in recent years, and you've been increasingly involved in the orbit of Christian conferences like this because of this interest that you've developed in the Christian story, history. You've obviously become massively well known also, not just through your written work, but through the podcast, The Rest is History, that you do with Dominic Sambrook. Tell us, though, for those who aren't familiar with your story, how this interest arose for you in telling Europe and the West its story again as regards Christian history.
Well, it actually goes all the way back to childhood, and I'm sure a groan will be going across the conference as I begin with that. But I do want to begin with that. So I was raised in the Church of England by my mother, who is still an absolute example for me of moral behavior. So I never had any issue with Christian ethics or teachings. But the truth was that although I was always very interested in the Bible, I much preferred the Greeks and the Romans. And even in the context of the Bible, I preferred Pharaoh. I preferred Pontius Pilate. I mean, it's a terrible kind of confession to make. And over the course of my teenage years, it was as though my faith started going down like a kind of dimmer switch. And when I kind of reached my 30s, I realized that actually what I wanted to do was to write history. I turned to the great dramas of Greek and Roman history and the great kind of figures of them, because that had what had most excited me as a child, the Spartans at Thermopylae, Caesar in Gaul, and so on. And I found over the process of writing those books, I found them more and more unsettling. Caesar, who slaughtered 1 million Gauls, Leonidas at Thermopylae, whose state was founded on systematic exploitation of a conquered Greek city. And so it troubled me how alien these people actually were in a way that I hadn't kind of faced up to as a child or up until my 30s, really. And so I started wondering, well, where do my values, where do my assumptions, where do my ethics come from? And began to realize that, of course, that it's Christianity. Christianity is the great revolutionary process that utterly transformed antiquity, to the degree that most of us in the modern West don't even recognize that revolution ever happened. But I was thinking, because this is a Catholic conference, I was thinking specifically of my relationship to Catholicism, which was a very Protestant one, I now realize, to the degree that when I first went to Rome and I actually saw a cardinal, my assumption was that he was off to poison a nunnery. I'd read so much Jacobean tragedy that I'd obviously just kind of imbibed this. And I began to realize that, I realize now looking back that my kind of atheism was very Protestant. It was a kind of, and I think the fusion of kind of modern atheism with Protestant anti-Catholicism is very close, to the degree that I think that, atheism of the Dawkins kind, I mean, it's simply Protestantism that has reached a level where it doesn't believe in God, which I'm sure you as Catholics may feel is the inevitable endpoint of Protestantism. And I wouldn't disagree, actually. I wouldn't disagree. But there were two things, and I'm sorry, I'm hogging the conversation here, but I just want to say, there were two things that going into the 21st century changed my opinion on this. The first was precisely this issue of well, if everything has changed since the classical world into the present day, where did that, what is the process of change? Of course, it's the coming of Christianity. That's the primal revolution. But was there something distinctive about what happened in Latin Europe? And I fixed on the 11th century as being the crucial moment. And I came to see the medieval church, the Roman church of the High Middle Ages, not as the kind of hidebound reactionary institution that my Protestant upbringing had kind of instinctively led me to see it as being, but actually as being the primal revolutionary institution in Western history. That the revolution that was initiated by reformers, people who called it reformatio, a reformation, in the 11th century, set the pattern for the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, for French Revolution, for whatever it is that we're going through at the moment. All of these, it's really the Catholic Church that blazed the path for that. So that was one perspective, and I wrote a book, Millennium, that kind of explored that idea in the first years of the first decade of the 21st century. At the same time, I had children, two daughters, who went to a Catholic school, Catholic primary school. And the reason for that was that my wife had been baptized Catholic, and her parents had then spectacularly lost their faith when they at her baptism, they had to confront the doctrine that she had been born with original sin. And they kind of lost their faith with a great whoosh and became militant atheists, and brought her up with an absolute ignorance, not just of the Catholic Church, but of Christianity generally. They were actively hostile to it. And then her mother died very horribly of Alzheimer's and cancer as our eldest daughter was being born. I mean, was in her first years. And Sadie went, I think, as a way of looking for some way to understand why and what was happening, went back to the Catholicism of her mother to try and understand what had made her mother what she was, and started going to the local church. And because of it, she then wanted our children to go to the local Catholic primary. I started going as well to the Catholic church. And it was a revelation, because it was a Jesuit church. And you can imagine how I viewed the Jesuits. Again, they'd offer me a cup of coffee after the Mass. But they were wonderful. I mean, they were brilliant pastoral priests, but also wonderful teachers. And one of them, Damien Howard, is the head of the Jesuits now in Britain. So we were very honoured to kind of have them. And there was an absolutely wonderful priest, Father Tom Hennigan, whose memory I would like to pay tribute to here, who was, I think, the saintliest man I ever met. And that experience kind of radically changed my opinion, not just of Christianity, but of Catholicism specifically, and definitely informed my desire to then write Dominion and see if that what I'd explored in Millennium, this idea that the Catholic Church, I think it's wrong to call it the Catholic Church. I mean, it is Catholic, but the medieval church, the Latin church in the 11th century, going through the Middle Ages, was this revolutionary institution. Could I trace that insight back to the beginnings of Christianity, and could I trace it forwards through the Reformation and into modernity up to the present day? So I'm not just saying, well, I am saying that because it's a Catholic conference, but it's no less the truth.
It's been part of your journey
for that. Yeah.
And I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with Tom's story and the way that he, at an intellectual level, came to see the way that all of Western culture has been shaped by the Christian Revolution 2,000 years ago. Bishop Barron, what's your response though to Tom's own journey as well, as he's gone on that pilgrimage, as it were?
Well, I mean, I find it fascinating. There's different dimensions to it. Some intellectual, but some more moral. I mean, it's the witness of great Christian saints that often makes a huge difference. Can I have my philosopher's hat on for a second? His comment about Protestantism, atheism, and so on is very interesting, because in the High Middle Ages, in the work of my intellectual hero, Thomas Aquinas, God is not a being. God is ipsum esse. God is the sheer act of to be itself. Now, what that means is God is not competing with us. So God's not one being among many. If God were just the supreme being, there's all of us and there's this big supreme being, God, then we're jostling for superiority on the same playing field. But God is ipsum esse, which means, and there's the burning bush example, right? As God comes close to us, we're not overwhelmed or destroyed, we're enhanced. But that got lost at a certain point philosophically. Think of the rise of nominalism and so on, where God is construed as a supreme being. But what happens is at first you'll be still piously related to that supreme being, but in time you'll begin to resent that supreme being. You'll see that supreme being as a threat to your freedom, a threat to your flourishing. And then at the end of the day, you might say, who needs him? We're doing fine without him. I think there is a trajectory from the loss of Aquinas' metaphysical view of God to atheism. So I think a recovery, I love the recovery of the High Middle Ages, not just artistically giving rise to the Gothic cathedrals and Dante, but philosophically, it was the right understanding of God. Now press that all the way back, that Jesus is both divine and human. The two natures come together without mixing, mingling, or confusion in the unity of one person. Well, that's not possible if God were a being, right? That God and humanity would be at odds with each other, battling. The fact that we can say Jesus is truly divine and truly human, that's a distinctive view of God. And it makes possible a real humanism, total respect for human freedom, etc. So I would trace some of those links all the way back philosophically and theologically that undergird some of the historical realities that Tom explores.
I mean, you yourself have obviously spoken at length and written at length, Tom, about the way that you see modern humanism, modern atheism, secularism as essentially an outgrowth of the Christian story. And to that extent, you've even described atheist secular humanism as a form of faith itself. Explain what you mean by that and why you think that actually it owes its roots in that sense to the Christian Revolution.
Oh, goodness. How long have we got? So maybe I should just tease out what I think the kind of the evolutionary links between modern atheism and Protestantism are, because I think they are also, go back a very long way. The ambition of modern atheists is it's an evangelical one. They have good news to preach, and the good news is that if you overthrow the idols of superstition, if you banish superstition, if you bring people who have walked in darkness into light, then they will be better people. They will be morally better people. They will live better lives. And the link to the arguments made by the Protestant reformers there is very, very evident, because the Protestant reformers were saying exactly the same, that the world is mired in darkness and superstition, that there are idols everywhere, that you topple these idols, you pull down the rood screens, you paint over the idolatrous images in churches, you whitewash them, and so on, then people will be brought into light. But it's not like this is a completely radical break, because the missionaries in the early Middle Ages are preaching exactly the same. They are going into pagan shrines and chopping down trees that are identified with gods and all kinds of things. And this is exactly the language that they are using. And of course, the language that they are using in turn ultimately derives from the Hebrew prophets. This is language that Isaiah is using. The idea that the gods worshipped by the Babylonians or the Egyptians are mere stock and stone. And so in a sense, you could see the entire history of Christianity going back even before the birth of Christ as being an expression of the conviction that idolatry, once it is overthrown, will bring people into the light. And it's in that sense, I think, that contemporary atheism, you know, wonderfully bearing in mind that Richard Dawkins is one of its chief evangelists, you know, that is the course of evolution. That is where the evolution has led.
Any thoughts on that?
My thought is, in the Bible, the option is not, you know, belief or unbelief. That's a modernism. The option is true belief or false belief, right? So people always have some relationship to a summum bonum, some highest good. We wouldn't get out of bed in the morning unless we did. Everyone has to have their values finally ordered in a hierarchy in relation to some highest value. Now, it might be, you know, pleasure, money, power, your country, or something, but everyone's got some highest good that they worship. And the biblical option, go back to people like Isaiah and company, is say, well, no, stop doing false worship, do true worship. Then read Augustine's City of God, the same thing. He thought the Romans had a bad summum bonum. They were worshiping false gods, and I've got the true God to give you. And Augustine, to me, is very illuminating there, because he saw the Roman gods as you know, violent and contentious and jealous and so on. And so we become what we worship. That's a basic Augustinian principle. And that's true. You become conformed to what you think the summum bonum is. So if that's the highest good, you become conformed to it. Augustine proposed the God whose name is love. And so the nonviolence of God is very interesting to me in the City of God. It becomes very important. If I worship the God whose name is love, then the City of God will break out in relation to it. I think those are still very relevant categories for us. What's the highest good? What are we worshiping? If it's something like sex or pleasure or country or money or power, we're going to have a messed up society. If it's the God whose name is love, then we got a fighting chance. I think that's the central argument of the City of God. So I would see that as the biblical.
And in a post-Christian culture that we're now living in, how is that message landing? And why? What are you seeing in terms of the people you're reaching? Do you find that they are tiring of the secular version, even as it has been informed by the Christian tradition? Do you think they're looking for something different now?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't really target so much the young people, but a lot of, let's say, people in their 20s, 30s would watch the things that I do. And I think they know deep down there's something deeply off about the society. And if all we have is the buffered self, to use Charles Taylor's language, but just this self that has no connection to the transcendent, is just the goods of this world, those are the highest goods, that we get messed up on the inside. So we have all the psychological and spiritual struggles, and then the society becomes skewed. And I think when religion is proposed in an intelligent, beautiful way, in a confident way, people respond to it. We became very apologetic. By we, I mean the Christians. We became very, oh, I'm sorry, and you know, I'll present my religion in a very superficial or domesticated way. I think when we do it boldly and confidently, the way Augustine did. You know, Augustine said, no, we shouldn't worship the Roman gods. I've got the true God for you, whose name is love, who's revealed in the cross of this first century rabbi. To use Tom's language, the weirdness of Christianity, I think, is very attractive to people, you know, but it's a weirdness from which a rightly ordered society comes.
Do you feel like your rapprochement with Christianity yourself, Tom, is that just an eccentric thing of your own, or do you see that as something that might be suggesting there's something going on in our culture that people aren't content any longer with the secular story? Well,
it's on two levels. I mean, the argument, maybe it's eccentric, but I think it is true. It seems to me patently true that we live in still a society that is utterly saturated with Christian assumptions, and that it has ceased to be Christian for utterly Christian reasons. I mean, that's the paradox of it. and why I think it's so hard for Christians actually now to make their case is that by and large the people they're opposing kind of agree with them, indeed have kind of made a massive land grab So much of what made Christianity distinctive, I mean, you know, from the perspective of the ancients, weird, is now taken for granted. And the state has nationalized so much that the church did, be it education or healthcare or, you know, concern for the weak and the poor and the suffering. So much of that has been appropriated by the state that, you know, what is left for the church to do? It cannot often seem.
That's the question then, I suppose, is, you know, our question before us is how can the church tell its story in a post-Christian world where, yet arguably, a lot of what it offered has been kind of, in a sense, taken on by the state. How do we make a distinctive story?
So for what it's worth, and I have, you know, I'm not in any way really qualified to opine on this, but for what it's worth, my feeling is that what the church has to do is to major on what still makes it distinctive. And so I think there is a risk at the moment that churches try and accommodate themselves to the new kind of elite dispensation, rather in the way that people in England, say, did in the 16th century, that they started to accommodate themselves to Protestantism because it was Protestants who were now, you know, leading the state, in the government, in universities and so on. And so bit by bit, people just adjusted themselves to that as being the way that the country was organized. And I think that Christians likewise are now doing that to a fundamentally secular order and it's easy for them to accommodate to that secular order because that secular order in all its assumptions and values and ethics tends to be Christian. So you can do it. The risk with that is that you end up as Christian leaders or as you know, the Christian laity becoming completely indistinguishable from the broader kind of secular bloc. Yeah. So I think the emphasis has to be firstly on reminding people that stuff that they take for granted is actually very odd. You know, there are no human rights if you're an atheist. You know, where do they come from? They don't exist any more than angels exist if you're an atheist, if you don't believe in any of that stuff. Assumptions about how and why you should behave that clearly derive from Christianity. The assumption that we should care for the weak or the poor, that the weak or the poor have any inherent value. This is a Christian insight that our society in the West would not have were it not for Christianity. So to remind people, you think this is just natural, you think this is a given, you think this just rises, you know, it's a kind of default assumption. It isn't. It's something that you believe. You have beliefs just as much as Christians have beliefs. But I think also there's a need to emphasize what's the theme today? Telling the Christian story. The Christian story is amazing. And I think that the ball the churches have dropped, and I'm talking about England here, I don't know whether it's the same in America, is that they have allowed generations of children to grow up with an unfamiliarity with the most basic stories that I think have done more to structure how people in the West over the past 1,000 years and more have come to think than anything else, that more than catechisms, more than statements of principle. It's the stories, it's the idea, it's the story of the passion, it's the story of Christ's suffering and then his triumph over torture and death and horror that has made the Christian people what they are and the modern West what they are. It's the story of Exodus, the idea that slaves have been brought out of bondage and brought to a new land. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. You know, if people want to understand why there is the current debate about how we should treat refugees or how we should treat those who are less fortunate than us, the parable of the Good Samaritan has done more to hardwire that into the collective consciousness of the West, I think, than any number of kind of statements of principle from political parties or philosophers or whatever. It's that story at the most basic level. And that reflects the fact that the Jesus of the Gospels is the greatest short storyteller of all time. His stories have had a greater impact on the way that the world thinks than any other storyteller. And it seems to me lunacy that children can go to church schools and come out of it lacking a familiarity with the most basic parables. It seems insane.
I wonder if you want to pick up on that, because one thing I noticed you mentioned in your opening address was it's not necessarily about modernization of the church, and I think that's what a lot of people...
modernity is a Christian heresy. So and I quite agree that I pick up on every point Tom just made. The trouble is we Christians have come hat in hand to the secular culture, hoping to find their approval. That's getting it completely backwards. That's the integrated Orthodox view coming to a heretical position and saying, "Can you please take us seriously?" And we stopped taking ourselves seriously. And then we did what Kant and company recommended, just turn Christianity into kind of a vague ethical system. But it's the very weirdness and distinctiveness and dense texture of Christianity that should be in the driver's seat culturally, it seems to me. My example of the principle that Tom was articulating, if I can I make reference to an American revolutionary? So when Jefferson blithely says in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Well, I mean, in the classical world, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, if you said, oh, it's self-evident that all people are equal, what? I mean, it was the opposite of self-evident to them. Plato's whole political philosophy is predicated upon the assumption that we're not equal, and that the more we recognize that, the more just society we have. Aristotle thought that only a handful of people should get involved in politics. Most are incapable of it. The equality. So what happened? That's the interesting question. What happened to go from that to Jefferson, late 18th century, saying it's self-evident? Well, of course, the giveaway is that little word that all men are created equal. What intervened was the Christian sense of creation. And then, furthermore, from Jefferson, they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Well, nobody in the ancient world believed in inalienable rights for everybody. A handful of privileged people, or they were the gift of the state or something. But that everybody's got inalienable rights. Well, again, the giveaway, they're endowed by their creator with these. I mean, so there's the intervention of Christianity into the conversation. So things become self-evident to us because they've been hardwired through the Christian influence. We should claim that. And that's why I very much admire Tom Holland's work, because we should claim that as Christians confidently and boldly and stop coming hat in hand to the culture, begging to be taken seriously. I think it should work the other way,
I wonder, one of the things Tom mentioned, and I'll just give it to you, Bishop Barron, and then give it back to Tom, was that his wife Sadie's baptism was the point at which her parents said, actually, I don't think we can believe any of this idea of original sin and so on. And that perhaps still is the stumbling block. It is the weirdness, because some things in Christianity do seem to jar with modern sensibilities. And of course, just this past week, the Church of England has been going through its own debates on sexuality and what modernization versus, historic biblical faith might look like in their scenario. So in the midst of all that happening, while we recognize that the church has been informed by the West, has been informed by the church and tradition, how do we tell that story in an atmosphere where a lot of what the church perhaps is saying is no longer felt to be relevant or even welcome in the world?
Boldly and confidently. I mean, I think, like the doctrine of original sin, I'm with your countryman, G.K. Chesterton. It's the only doctrine for which there's clear empirical evidence, because, but properly understood, right? That's Chesterton. Properly understood, I mean, original sin, it's the poisonous atmosphere in which we're all born, and we're inescapably affected by it. It's like, the best example to me is like a child whose mother's addicted to crack or something, and the child is born in complete innocence in one sense, but nevertheless addicted to this terrible drug and suffering from all the effects of it. Well, look at the Council of Trent, the wonderful statements on anthropology there. We're like members of a dysfunctional family. Someone that's born into a family that with alcohol abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse, the child is born in one sense in complete innocence, but willy-nilly affected deeply by the dysfunction of the family into which he's born, right? Well, that's us, Again, Chesterton, what's the, we're all in the same boat and we're all seasick, right? But that's how we're born. And so to me, the doctrine of original sin, it makes perfect sense. And it's programs of perfectibility. There's the problem. From Karl Marx on, people that say we can be perfected, God protect us from them, because then they'll come up with some social program that will affect this perfection. So no. I like the doctrine of original sin, and we should proclaim it from the rooftops.
What do you think of original sin, Tom?
We're all sinners, Dustin. We're all sinners. So, my wife was born in 1967, so I guess her baptism was, I don't know, late 60s. And I think that the 60s will come to be seen by future historians as a decade as convulsive for what we might call Christendom as the 1520s were. And I think the repudiation of the doctrine of original sin was actually the single most dramatic kind of theological intervention of the 60s, because it came to be kind of paradigmatic of everything that the cutting edge of 60s culture was all about. It was the idea that, if you only, that people who affirmed the idea of original sin were blue meanies. And if you only got rid of them, then it would be non-stop Pepperland. There'd be Beatles music and psychedelic colors, and it'd all be groovy and hangout and free love and brilliant. And even as this doctrine was being propounded in the 60s, events of the late 60s were suggesting that perhaps there might be problems with this kind of hope. I think that we live in a Pelagian age now. So Pelagius, the great kind of opponent of Augustine, who became I guess Augustine is the figure who for Catholic and Protestant theologians alike stands behind them when they have talked about the doctrine of original sin. Augustine has been repudiated, it seems to me, since the 60s. Pelagius has been enshrined, even though lots of people wouldn't necessarily think of it in those terms. But I think to an extent, we live with the corollary of that, because actually the great thing about the doctrine of original sin, more than anything else, is that it's democratic. All of us share in it. And as the bishop suggested, the notion that perfectibility is possible is dangerous, because it implies that if you don't become perfect, then it's your fault. And I think that the sense of those who are possessed by a desire to make the world better, which is the most admirable instinct and has been one that generations and generations of people in the Christian West have always had, that instinct is now combined with a sense of contempt for those who define themselves as virtuous tend to feel for those who have been left behind. And so I think that the paradox of those who are simultaneously radically anti-Christian, anti the doctrine of free sin, and who see themselves as virtuous, they are actually becoming the kind of parody of a malevolent Christian that they feel that they're opposing. Even the most, every Christian, even the most saintly, has to know that he or she is fallen, and therefore has to feel compassion with the sinner. But if you feel that someone can wash him or herself clean of sin, then you're entitled to feel contempt for the sinner. Why haven't they made themselves better? And that's where you start to get really, really vicious virtue spirals.
So you see that happening in some areas of culture where you're seeing certain types of ideology that almost say, now we know the truth, we are in the light, and everyone else has essentially...
I think contemporary culture seems like nothing but a kind of, a great spiraling of endless virtue.
Quick response spirals, to that, Bishop Barron, and then we'll go to some of these questions.
Well, the struggle between Pelagius and Augustine is one of the most titanic in the history of theology, and everything hinged upon it. If Pelagius had won, and indeed in many ways he has today, but if he had won, Christianity is over, because we're a salvation religion. If I can save myself, I don't need a savior. And then Jesus devolves into being a moral archetype of some kind. But why not Oprah? Why not anybody else could be a moral archetype? So if I can make myself better by, just putting my shoulder to the plow and so on, but if I'm broken in some fundamental way, again, like someone who's, let's say, born addicted to a drug, you can't say, I'm going to will my way out of this. No, you're fundamentally compromised in such a way that you need something from outside the broken system itself, right, to save you. Hence, by the way, everybody, why Jesus is both fully human and fully divine again. If he's simply human, okay, he's our brother and our friend and all those good things, but then he's as broken as we are. And he might be inspiring and he might be this and that, but he's not going to save us. If he's divine, he comes from outside the broken system in some very fundamental way, but enters into the broken system. Now look at the cross too. The one who can save us, entering in every possible sense into our brokenness, thereby to heal it. That's what the church fathers saw. That was key to Christianity. If you take, say, original sin, as we've been describing it, out of the equation, that whole thing falls apart. And you get the Jesus that we get today, which is our friend, our brother, our moral exemplar. Well, okay, then he's like, anybody else. He's like a Sufi mystic or like any other wisdom figure. But then the heck with him. Then there are 1,000 gurus out there I could follow. But if Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior, now we have Christianity. We have our problem that's so fundamental that we can't solve it has been solved by the one who can, So it much hinges on that Pelagius-Augustine debate.
We want to go to some questions that I'm sure there are lots of and we'll only scratch the surface of. But perhaps we could have up on the screen. I know that the team have been busy putting together some of these so that we can see what some of our folk in the audience wanted to ask. Here we go. Tom, who is your favourite Roman emperor or general, and who is your favourite saint?
Oh, my favourite emperor by miles is Nero.
Interesting choice.
Awful, but I love him. He's by miles the most entertaining emperor.
Right.
So he... Okay, so there's the whole matricide thing, yes, but we'll draw a veil over that. He raced, he won gold at the Olympics racing chariot. He appeared on the stage. He played the lyre. And it's basically the equivalent, if I was emperor of the world, I would jig things so that I could win Formula One, headline at Glastonbury, win best actor Oscar every year. I mean, that's basically what he's doing. He's a tremendous lad, and
perhaps
I kind of love it.
The embodiment of that pre-Christian classical era.
Yes,
in that sense.
Because it's very charismatic. There's the whore of Babylon and all that kind of stuff. I mean,
favorite saints as well.
My favorite saint is Saint Cuthbert. The great Northumbrian saint, who would stand in his neck in the North Sea praying, and then he would come out onto the beach barefoot, and anyone who's come out of the sea barefoot, and in a Northumbrian beach there are a lot of pebbles, and then sea otters would come and warm his feet, and I love that sense of the engagement with the totality of creation that Cuthbert embodies, and the totality of his commitment to God, and I love the fact that of all the saints who came to be enshrined in the cathedrals of medieval Europe, his relics alone survived the Reformation. That Cromwell's men turned up in Durham Cathedral, demolished his shrine, dug up his body, and it was preserved. It's still intact. And they went, "Whoa, what are we going to do about this?" And so they laid it in a side annex and didn't really know what to do. And then they just reburied it. So Cuthbert's remains are still behind the high altar in Durham Cathedral. And as someone who feels very kind of, I love the Anglican tradition, the Protestant tradition that I was raised, but I'm also incredibly moved and inspired by the traditions of medieval Christianity in this country, and particularly I think the Anglo-Saxon saints, these titanic moral figures who first taught Christianity in what must have been an unbelievably harsh and hostile environment. Cuthbert seems to me the saint that that best expresses that. And I also love the fact that he played his part in the Second World War. I've been told this by several Geordies, that when the Luftwaffe were heading towards Newcastle and Durham, people prayed to Cuthbert, and a fog came, and fog on the Tyne, and the Luftwaffe had to go back. Yeah. I don't know whether that story is true. I suspect it probably is.
It's a great story either way.
I love to think it. And I think it shows the... You know, Cuthbert struck down a Viking who disabused him, and for about 60 years he ruled the whole of the lands between the Tyne and the Tees, even though he was dead. And current political shenanigans makes me think that perhaps we should get him back on the job.
Cuthbert. Yeah.
I think he's great, and I think he should be England's national saint.
Great, wonderful. Maybe we'll go for another question. And see what's being asked. If the world gets harsher and more unstable, and people lose confidence in the state and the market to provide hope, will the need for transcendent hope return? Perhaps you could start us off on this one, Bishop Barron.
Well, the transcendent hope is always there. It might be buried a bit, or it might be implicit rather than explicit. I think it's always there. I take page 1 of the Confessions as my marching orders in a way. You know, Lord, you made us for yourself, and therefore our heart is restless till it rests in thee. And the fact that Augustine didn't put that in the plural, but the singular, right? Cor nostrum, meaning everybody's got this in common. We're all, Bruce Springsteen said it, right? Everyone's got a hungry heart. But everybody has a restless heart, the heart that's ordered to God. So the hope is always there for the transcendent, but we have to awaken it. You know, we have to appeal to it. There's again the danger of the buffered self that's denying the longing of the heart. That's the trouble with secularism as an ideology, that convinces people you can be satisfied by enough wealth, power, pleasure, and honor, the 4 great substitutes. And the churches have always been there to say, no, those things are fine, but they're creatures. That's what the Hebrew prophets said too. Don't hook the infinite desire for God onto something finite. It'll make you crazy and addicted. Look at the story of the priests of Baal. To me, is so telling there. You know, they're calling upon their gods, and they're hopping around the altars and then wounding themselves. Remember, until they bleed. That to me is a beautiful metaphor of what happens when you hook the desire for God onto a false god. Is you become crazy and then addicted to it. And Elijah calling upon Yahweh and the fire comes. It's not just, isn't that great? My God's bigger than your God. It's making that spiritual point that only the true God will answer the longing of the heart. And secularism is a kind of hopping around the altars of the priests of Baal all the time. And I think you can see it on clear display in the society that people are becoming deeply addicted to all these things. And we've got to be there with a word of salvation and liberation, you know. Can I say too, I love the Durham Cathedral. I've been there twice. Anyone from Southwark here? When I came to Leeds many years ago, I was invited to give talks by, at the time, Bishop Arthur Roach, who's now a cardinal in Rome, right? And he invited me, and I was picked up at the airport, Manchester, by John Wilson, the current Archbishop of Southwark. And he picked me up, and we're going, I said, how far is it to Durham from here? And I forget what he said, but it wasn't all that far. And I said, can you take me there? I want to see the Durham Cathedral. So that was the first stop we made.
Wow.
And I've always loved that cathedral.
Wonderful, wonderful. Tom, anything to add on this sense of, with the current political and social atmosphere out there, are people looking for something more?
I think people always do in times of plague and war and kind of dread. And simply as a statement of historical fact, Christianity has proven itself to be the most successful attempt devised by humanity to explain why humanity is here and why there is hope in a world that might seem oppressed by horror. It is not, I mean, it is, the Marxist take on that is that it's an opiate, that it numbs and dulls people. but I would say that perhaps Christianity can only most fully, it's the potential of its explanations and its dramas and its narratives. Perhaps it takes difficult times fully to kind of accentuate what it has to offer, perhaps. It's kind of like, you know, a sculpture that's in darkness or shadow, and difficult times kind of sharpens the light so that you can see it more clearly. Because Christianity emerged in a time, you know, in times of plague, and it survived the implosion of the Roman peace and flourished amid violence and horror. And so, but I'm reluctant to say, well, what the revival of Christianity needs is a really good war. No, it's...
well, I appreciate that, and who knows what the future may hold, but I guess from your point of view, God in his grace uses all kinds of means, be they good or evil, to bring about his ultimate purpose.
Yeah, the church has been around from ancient empires through medieval monarchies into modern nation states, through totalitarian systems up to the present day, sometimes flourishing, sometimes under fierce persecution. No need to remind you of that. You know, it happened here for a long time. That to me is a rather amazing fact in itself. Just the simple endurance of the church across the ages. Tom Holland can tell that story in much more detail than I can, but the very fact that we're still here matters to me enormously. If anyone's seen the Catholicism series I did years ago, I reflected on Cardinal George's experience. I mentioned him earlier, when they elected Pope Benedict, and they came up on the balcony of St. Peter's there, and he had this very pensive look on his face, and the camera came in on him. And people asked him when he got home, what were you thinking about? And Cardinal George, who had a keen sense of history, said, well, I was kind of gazing out toward the Palatine Hill, and I was wondering, where are Caesar's successors? They're long gone, but Peter's successor is right there, and he's smiling and waving at the crowds. And there's something deeply weird about that. You know, now Caesar has indirect successors, of course, but I mean, the Roman Empire, that's long gone, but yet the Church of Jesus that Peter and Paul and company brought to Rome, it's still alive and kicking, and that's interesting.
I remember during the pandemic, one of the moments that still absolutely resonates with me was the Pope conducted a service in St. Peter's Square. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was quite early in the it was early in the pandemic, and he was doing it, you know, socially distanced, so there was no one else really with him in St. Peter's Square. And as he performed the service, you could hear the clanging of bells and the wailing of sirens from all the ambulances taking people to hospital in the background. And then he went and prayed before an icon of the Virgin and the infant Christ that, according to tradition, had been sent from Constantinople to Gregory I, Gregory the Great, the Pope who sent missionaries to Britain. And Gregory had become Pope in a time of plague. So the Castel Sant'Angelo, the great statue of St. Michael sheathing his sword, alludes to a legend that dates back to the time of Gregory the Great, the plague arrows were raining down, and Gregory led a procession through the streets of Rome offering up prayer, and St. Michael appeared on the tomb of Hadrian, as it was, and sheathed his sword. And this is what's shown in the famous statue of St. Michael on the Castel Sant'Angelo. But the further kind of distance is that Gregory the Great wrote a commentary on the book of Job, and Job is, you know, I mean, it's possibly the greatest text ever written on the great imponderable question of how an all-good God can allow bad things to happen, basically. And that sense of the fact that what we were going through in 2020 was something that people back in the 6th century had gone through and wrestled with, and that they in turn were looking back to whenever the book of Job was written, and the feeling that we had this immense resource of writings and examples and communion with generations and generations and generations of people who had gone through what we were going through during the pandemic, I found unbelievably powerful. And that is something that I suppose Christianity offers perhaps as powerfully as any tradition that's ever been.
Thank you. Well, we've time. Yes, please do. I think that's very powerful. We've time, I think, for one more question, and this probably is going to be our summary of our conversation today. Tom and Bishop Barron, what is the role of the church in society today, and what can it be? So just a small one to finish with. But I'll start with you, Tom, and then Bishop Barron. What's the role of the church then?
Well, the church, I mean, what do we mean by the church? I guess it's a Catholic conference, so you'll all have a
view on what that is.
You know, but there are many churches. Are they all one church? I guess. But I think the problem for all the churches is precisely the fact that we are living through what is a great new convulsion of reformatio, a remaking, a remolding of society and the way that people within it understand it. I think that what is animating people on the cutting edge of this derives from Christianity, but I think that without the framework of familiarity with Scripture, familiarity with doctrines, with church, the simple functioning of the church, I think that that inheritance of Christianity is starting to mutate in often to Christianize quite strange ways. And I don't know where that will lead. I also can't remember what the question was.
Well, it was
lolling off in all kinds of directions. What was the question?
Well, what should the role, I think, was
right.
The question.
So I think the role of the church for Christians should be to define themselves very, very clearly against this process.
Okay.
Because what is happening is the cannibalization of the historical inheritance of the church. And if the church isn't careful, then it will be cannibalized as well.
Okay, that's really helpful. Bishop Barron.
I wonder if I could rehearse something I did at Parliament on Monday night. I mentioned Dorothy Day earlier, right? Well, her co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement was a guy named Peter Morin. And Peter Morin said, we've taken the dynamite of the church, we put it in hermetically sealed containers and have sat on the lid. It's time to blow up the dynamite of the church, right? Well, I'm telling that story and I caught myself and I said, okay, wait a minute, I'm a Catholic bishop in Parliament talking about blowing up dynamite. I said it might not be the right time and place for that metaphor. But of course, what Peter Morin, who was a great advocate of nonviolence, what he meant, dunamis, right? Power in the Greek, that there's a power in the gospel. And now he's writing that back in the 1930s, that we've taken the power of the gospel and we've kind of covered it up and we've domesticated it somehow. Well, the other thing I did at the Parliament, I began the talk by talking about this young Hindu law student who comes to London, 1888. And at first he's so shy, he won't even leave his room. He's so afraid of speaking English. It's Gandhi, of course. And eventually Gandhi falls in with a group of Christians who challenged him to read the Bible. And like most first-time readers of the Bible, the Old Testament was pretty opaque to him. But he read the New Testament, this young, very curious Indian law student. And it was chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew that electrified him. He read the Sermon on the Mount and said, yeah, the love of enemies and nonviolence and turn the other cheek, construed not as passivity, but as a real way of engaging evil in a creative, loving way. All that. And he ran to his Christian friends and he said, I found this most extraordinary thing in your book. And they all said, well, no one really takes that too seriously. I mean, that's nice ideals, but we don't really follow it. But by God, he did. He goes back to his native country eventually with the message of the gospel, and then used it to enormous, effect. And I found wonderful, then he's imitated by people like Martin Luther King in my country. How beautiful, by the way, when I was strolling around this central area of London when I first arrived, and there was a statue of Gandhi, and I thought of that young law student, coming here. And then right across on the facade of the Abbey is Martin Luther King, Well, King, the Christian preacher, but he is inspired by Gandhi, who got it from Matthew 5. See, but that's the dynamite of the church. That's it. Because the nonviolence Jesus is talking about is reflective of the nonviolent God who made the universe not through violence, but through an act of love and all of that. The nonviolence of the cross, right? And then what's hovering above the whole parliament, I said, was the Union Jack, which is 3 crosses. So you have the cross on which this young Jewish rabbi is put to death 2,000 years ago, weirdly hangs over the whole of the civic life of this country. Well, that's worth thinking about. That's part of the dynamite of the church. And I think that's the role of the church, is to keep proclaiming it in season and out. When they're throwing flowers at us and when they're killing us, we should keep announcing that message.
What a privilege it's been to sit down with you both. I apologise we didn't have time for more questions, but I hope that you'll go and listen to The Rest is History, Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook's podcast. Read Dominion. It's an amazing book. And obviously watch Word on Fire in all its various incarnations. But for now, would you again give a great big thank you to Tom and Bishop Barron?